Okay, good morning. Today we're going to be conducting session 1, and we'll be doing a deep dive into the interface reaction pattern and discussing contrasts between specific entities in this reaction pattern. So I'm going to share my screen. And first, to give you an introduction to the two basic ends of the spectrum of the interface reaction pattern, I'll highlight two disease entities. The first one is Lichen planus, which is the prototype for your, essentially for your lichenoid interface reaction pattern. And in this pattern, we expect to see on low power a band-like or lichenoid infiltrate along the dermal epidermal junction comprised of predominantly lymphocytes, coupled with vacuolar degeneration of the basal epidermis with associated apoptotic keratinocytes within the epidermis. In this example, there are other features that are specific for this diagnostic entity, Lichen planus, but I just want to highlight the presence of this lichenoid infiltrate in concert with vacuolar degeneration of the basilar epidermis as key features, coupled with, on closer examination, apoptotic keratinocytes, as you'll see here. And as we look across the basilar epidermis, we see more examples of those apoptotic keratinocytes associated with this lymphocytic infiltrate and some degree of melanin incontinence as well along the dermal epidermal junction. Let's contrast that with the other end of the spectrum, which is an entity that demonstrates more of a vacuolar interface pattern. And in this example, the epidermis is relatively much more atrophic, and you do see that vacuolar degeneration of the basal epidermis in conjunction with scattered apoptotic keratinocytes, but not much in the way of that lichenoid infiltrate. In fact, we have mostly a very mild perivascular infiltrate, and the most striking feature here is the vacuolar degeneration of the basal epidermis, as you can see. There is also concomitant melanin incontinence. And again, on higher power, you can appreciate the scattered apoptotic keratinocytes. Okay, so we've introduced the two ends of that spectrum. The first pair of entities I want to cover is to discuss the distinction between Lichen planus and secondary syphilis. In Lichen planus, the key feature that we look for, starting from the top, here we have a punch biopsy down to the superficial subcutis, and you can see that we have compact hyperkeratosis or orthohyperkeratosis. We have no parakeratosis, so you don't see parakeratosis in Lichen planus. The granular layer is thickened, and in areas it might resemble a wedge-shaped hypergranulosis, as you can see in these zones. The epidermis is hyperplastic, and it's irregularly hyperplastic in a jagged or sawtoothed-like fashion. And you can see the sharpening of the reedy pegs down to points. So it has that jagged look to it. In addition, you have kind of that heavy band-like or lichenoid infiltrate that is obscuring the dermal epidermal junction, and you start to appreciate clefting associated with vacuolization of the basal epidermis. These are called Max-Joseph spaces, and they're very characteristic for Lichen planus. Some more clefting. You have melanin incontinence as well. Melanin in macrophages in the superficial dermis. And then you also see scattered apoptotic keratinocytes if you look closely, but those apoptotic keratinocytes tend to be restricted more to the basal layer of the epidermis. So you don't tend to see them up high in the granular layer. The other thing you'll notice is that the infiltrate along the basilar epidermis is predominantly lymphocytic. So they're admixed histiocytes, but it's mostly lymphocytes. You don't see neutrophils, you don't see parakeratosis, and the infiltrate beyond the band-like infiltrate, you'll see a little bit of an infiltrate around these superficial dermal vessels, but you typically don't see an infiltrate down deep into the dermis in lichen planus. So now let's contrast that with syphilis. In syphilis, parakeratosis is the norm. You will see some degree of parakeratosis in syphilis. And here you can see in syphilis, we've got a little bit of parakeratosis in the stratum corneum. In some areas, it's still retaining that basket weave to slightly compact stratum corneum. The other thing you'll see is that the granular layer is not obvious. In fact, we have hypogranulosis. You don't have wedge-shaped hypergranulosis in cutaneous syphilis. The epidermis is hyperplastic, and this heavy lichenoid infiltrate is it's obscuring the junction between the epidermis and the dermis, and makes it difficult to appreciate the distinction between those two structures. But you can still make out that the epidermis has these elongated, thin, slender strands that are dipping down into the dermis. So you don't have the jagged, saw-toothed nature of the reedy pegs that you see in lichen planus, but they're more slender and kind of elongated as well. Another characteristic feature. Another thing you'll see are neutrophils. You can see neutrophils both in the epidermis as well as in the dermis in syphilis. So in syphilis, again, you do have the apoptotic keratinocytes because this is a lichenoid interface process. You will see some neutrophils, and if they're present, they'll usually be in the parakeratotic crust. So there are a few neutrophils in the crust here, and sometimes you'll see them even in the dermal infiltrate. The dermal infiltrate tends to be, depending on the age of the lesion, a mix of lymphocytes, but predominantly histiocytes. You might even see multinucleated giant cells in older lesions. Plasma cells tend to feature quite prominently as well. And you can see plasma cells here. There's a couple of plasma cells. These two guys facing each other. And if you look closely through the infiltrate, you'll see many more plasma cells. But there are also lots of admixed histiocytes, as well as lymphocytes. And here are some more plasma cells. That's a plasma cell there. See if we can find a few more plasma cells. But plasma cells tend to be a feature that's closely linked with syphilis, and often is a trigger for us to get a treponema pallidum stain in cases where we are suspicious for syphilis, secondary syphilis. It's another plasma cell there. So once again, neutrophils in this infiltrate, you can definitely see neutrophils. They're not the predominant cell type, but there's a neutrophil, a nice, perfect polymorphonuclear leukocyte, a neutrophil there. And as you look closely, you'll see neutrophils throughout this infiltrate. So this is a great feature for syphilis, the presence of neutrophils. Another feature, oh, there's a beautiful multinucleated giant cell there. Another feature that you'll appreciate with syphilis is that the blood vessels are kind of slammed shut, so you don't really appreciate them as blood vessels. And that's because there's significant endothelial cell swelling to the point where the vessels are just slit-shaped structures, and you don't really see the vascular lumina, but you will see these plump endothelial cells that are swollen and surrounded by the mixed infiltrate. So those are the key features of syphilis that allow you to distinguish it from lichen planus in this case. The next set of entities I want to review is lichen sclerosus atrophicus and scleroderma. Scleroderma is not an interface process, but I want to use it to distinguish one of the key features in lichen sclerosus. And so in lichen sclerosis here, we've got a punch biopsy down to the superficial subcutis. And in lichen sclerosis atrophicus, orthokeratosis tends to be very striking. So you can see that there's some compact keratosis or orthokeratosis of the stratum corneum. Follicular plugging is sometimes a feature. So you'll see swirls of collagen, usually within follicular ostia. So there's plugging. And then the epidermis itself tends to be effaced. So you can see that we've lost the natural reedy ridge undulating pattern. It's quite effaced. We've got, in some instances, this is obviously a well-developed lesion of lichen sclerosis atrophicus. So you'll see this nice sort of band-like infiltrate of lymphocytes beneath a zone of pale pink homogenized sclerotic collagen containing ectatic blood vessels. And in some instances, you'll see extravasated red blood cells too within these zones of sclerotic collagen. And then beneath that, again, you have that band-like infiltrate. In very early lesions of lichen sclerosis atrophicus, that band-like infiltrate is right up against the dermal-epidermal junction. And the vacuolar alteration of the epidermis tends to be much more striking in those early stage lesions. As we biopsy more advanced stage lesions, the sclerosis of the papillary dermis becomes more striking, and the lichenoid infiltrate gets pushed down into the dermis. And in very late stages, you might not see much of a residual lymphocytic infiltrate. The reticular dermis, in contrast to the papillary dermis, is unaffected. So you don't have sclerosis of the reticular dermis, which is another distinguishing feature between lichen sclerosis and scleroderma, as we'll see. And then the last feature I want to highlight is the fact that the adnexal structures in lichen sclerosis are unaffected. They are relatively unaffected, and you can see some eccrine glands and hair follicles in the deep dermis. Now, scleroderma, in contrast, tends to be a nice square biopsy. So we've got a punch biopsy down to the superficial subcutis. And the epidermis is usually relatively normal. So you don't see any vacuolar interface change in the epidermis. You don't really see much in the way of stratum corneum changes. But you do get the sense that there is a thickening and sclerosis of the collagen in the dermis with thickened collagen bundles, and you kind of lose that natural clefting. The white spaces between the collagen bundles is pretty much obliterated. The other thing you'll notice is that there's a paucity of adnexal structures in the involved skin. So we don't have adnexae. Hair follicles, eccrine glands are kind of lost. And then it's possibly inflammatory, but if you do see a little bit of a perivascular patchy infiltrate, plasma cells tend to be featured prominently in scleroderma. So you'll see that there's a collection of plasma cells here with eccentrically placed nuclei and amphiphilic cytoplasms. So this is an example of scleroderma. And those are really the key distinguishing features between scleroderma. So you don't have vacuolar alteration, epidermis looks normal, you don't have follicular plugging, you don't have orthokeratosis. The papillary dermis is not, is not relatively as affected as the reticular dermis, although you do definitely have some sclerosis of the papillary dermis. And again, it tends to be pandermal sclerosis of both the superficial and deep dermis. And then, as I mentioned, the adnexal structures are absent. The next set of entities we'll discuss is the distinction between Erythema multiforme and pleva. So Erythema multiforme tends to have what we call an acute stratum corneum. So when you look at the stratum corneum, you'll notice that the basket weave pattern is retained because this is an acute process that occurs. So you, in large part, have retention of the basket weave stratum corneum, and you may have mild parakeratosis that develops in later stage lesions. The epidermis is typically not hyperplastic. It might look hyperplastic in this example because we're biopsying a site where the epidermis is usually thicker. So you have to know where the biopsy was obtained from in order to assess for whether or not the epidermis is hyperplastic or not. This is an acral site. Another feature of E. multiforme is you'll have many necrotic keratinocytes, and you'll see them at all levels of the epidermis. In some areas, those necrotic keratinocytes start to become more confluent, so you might have zones of epidermal necrosis. Okay, as you can see here, we have a cluster of many apoptotic keratinocytes, but as we scan through, we see many more epidermal keratinocytes or necrotic keratinocytes. There is a little bit of a lichenoid inflammatory infiltrate kind of tracking along the dermal-epidermal junction. It's not heavy, but it's there, and concomitant with that, we can see some vacuolization of the basilar epidermis as well. Okay, so if we follow the contours of the reedy pegs, you can see some vacuolar degeneration of the basilar epidermis. Another feature that you'll see are neutrophils. So you might see neutrophils if you have confluent zones of epidermal necrosis, like here. You might start to see neutrophils kind of tracking up into the epidermis in those areas, okay? And there's a little bit of crush happening here, but might be some neutrophils kind of lining up there and starting to track up into the epidermis, okay? And then sometimes vesiculation can be seen in the papillary dermis, but mostly what you'll see is just edema of the papillary dermis. So the papillary dermal collagen kind of has that pale pink color, which is indicative of some edema in the papillary dermis, okay? And then you might have a sparse, as you can see here, sparse perivascular inflammatory infiltrate, which is kind of mixed. Lymphocytes, histiocytes predominate. So this is an example of E. multiforme or Erythema multiforme. Now let's contrast that with pleva. So in pleva, you tend to have focal or confluent parakeratosis. So you can see here that we have this huge mound of parakeratosis up high in the stratum corneum. And usually those zones of parakeratosis will have some serum in them. That frothy pale pink stuff is all serum. And concomitant with that, you'll see neutrophils too. You'll see neutrophils in that scale crust. So that's a very common feature of pleva. In Erythema multiforme, we saw lots of necrotic keratinocytes, but in pleva, you'll just typically see a few necrotic keratinocytes. So you won't see as many necrotic keratinocytes, and I'll point those out here. There's a necrotic keratinocyte there. There's another one there. But you can see that they're not as plentiful as we saw in Erythema multiforme. You have basal layer vacuolization, as you can see here. Oh, there's another apoptotic keratinocyte there. So you have vacuolization of the basal epidermis. You'll have a patchy perivascular lymphocytic inflammatory infiltrate with lots of extravasated red blood cells, much more than you'll ever see in Erythema multiforme. And at times you'll see those red blood cells tracking up into the epidermis as well. The infiltrate tends to be situated around the blood vessels in the superficial dermis, and then you'll also see it around the deeper vascular plexus. And so people describe a wedge-shaped superficial and deep dermal perivascular infiltrate because it kind of tapers at the tip, so you can imagine kind of a wedge-shaped pattern of inflammation around the superficial and deep vascular plexus. Vesiculation is common in the epidermis, so you'll see vesicles forming in the epidermis. That's common in pleva. You can see that in pleva. You can also see it in E. multiforme. It tends not to be as common in pleva as it is in E. multiforme, but again, that's not a feature that in practice I've found to be very helpful in distinguishing these entities. So those are really the key distinguishing features between pleva and E. multiforme. The next set of entities I want to talk about is lichen planus versus lichenoid drug. Just to reacquaint you with lichen planus, I'll throw that up there again. This is lichen planus. Now, lichenoid drug, in contrast, epidermis may be atrophic in lichenoid drug reaction, but parakeratosis tends to be a very prominent feature of lichenoid drug reactions. In fact, oftentimes you'll see end-to-end parakeratosis as we have here. You shouldn't see that in lichen planus. You don't have wedge-shaped hypergranulosis. So you look at the granular layer and it's very thinned to absent in most areas. That's characteristic for lichenoid drug reaction. You do see necrotic keratinocytes because this is an interface reaction pattern. But those necrotic keratinocytes are not limited just to the basilar epidermis as they would be in Lichen planus, but you also see them in the granular layer. As you can see here, there's a necrotic keratinocyte up high. There's another one there. So it's not uncommon to see necrotic keratinocytes up into the granular layer in lichenoid drug reactions. But as I've mentioned, you also see it in the basal epidermis. Okay, these are all necrotic keratinocytes. The other thing is that the reedy ridges don't have that jagged or saw-toothed appearance. They tend to be rounded, okay? They tend to be more rounded and less jagged in their shape. And then when you look at the inflammatory cells, eosinophils tend to feature very prominently. So you can see eosinophils in the epidermis, but if you look at the lichenoid infiltrate, you'll also see lots of eosinophils too. So you can see eosinophils in the infiltrate here, all the way along the junction and in the epidermis. Some more eosinophils. As we scroll across, you're seeing lots of eosinophils. So all of those features together help in the distinction between lichenoid drug and Lichen planus. Now, life doesn't read textbooks, so there are instances where you might see parakeratosis and or eosinophils in Lichen planus,